Do you actually need repetition to form long-term memories? The Atkinson and Shiffrin's multi-store model of memory suggests that you do. In this evaluation, we'll look at that and other aspects related to the MSM. One major strength of the MSM is that it's supported by a large amount of research evidence suggesting that short-term memory and long-term memory are separate systems. For example, Alan Baddeley in 1966 found differences in the way information is coded in short-term memory and long-term memory. When participants used their short-term memory, they were more likely to confuse words that sounded similar, such as cap and map. However, when they relied on long-term memory, they tended to confuse words with similar meanings, such as big and large. Further support comes from studies investigating capacity and duration, which consistently show that STM has a limited capacity and short duration, whereas LTM appears to have a much larger capacity and can last for years, even a lifetime. Taken together, these findings support the MSM's claim that STM and LTM are distinct and independent memory stores. However, despite the strong research support, there is a key limitation related to ecological validity. In everyday life, we usually remember meaningful information, such as people's names, faces, and places, as well as important facts. Many of the studies used to support the MSM did not reflect this. Instead, they often relied on artificial materials, such as digits and letters, as used in Jacob's research, single words as used by Baddeley, and consonant syllables with no meaning, such as those used by Peterson and Peterson. Because these materials lack meaning, it's questionable whether the findings accurately represent how memory works in real-life situations. And this suggests that the MSM may be oversimplified and may not fully explain everyday memory processes. Another important limitation of the MSM is evidence suggesting that there's more than one type of short-term memory, rather than a single STM store. Shallis and Warrington in 1970 studied a patient known as KF, who suffered from amnesia following brain damage. KF showed a very poor STM for auditory information, such as digits read aloud to him. However, his recall was much better when he read the digits silently to himself. Later studies of KF and similar patients suggested that there may even be a separate short-term store for non-verbal sounds, such as noises. This evidence contradicts the MSM's assumption that STM is a single unitary store handling all types of information. Instead, it supports the idea of multiple short-term memory systems, as proposed in later models, such as the working memory model that we'll look at later in this series. The MSM also places strong emphasis on rehearsal as the key mechanism for transferring information from STM to LTM. According to the model, the more an item is rehearsed, in other words, repeated over and over, the more likely it is to be stored in long-term memory. This type of rehearsal is known as prolonged maintenance rehearsal. However, research suggests that the type of rehearsal may be more important than the amount. Craik and Watkins in 1973 found that elaborative rehearsal leads to much better long-term retention than simple repetition. So what is elaborative rehearsal? It's where you think about the meaning of information and perhaps link it to existing knowledge. This shows that information can be transferred into LTM without prolonged rehearsal, which the MSM fails to explain. As a result, the model does not fully account for how long-term memory storage actually occurs. A final limitation is that the MSM presents memory as a linear step step-by-step process where information must pass through STM before reaching LTM. However, research shows that some information can enter LTM directly, especially if it's emotionally significant or highly meaningful. For instance, imagine a pupil is walking home from school and suddenly witnesses a serious road accident. A car runs a red light, hits another vehicle, and pedestrians rush to help. The scene's shocking and emotionally intense. The pupil does not rehearse what they have seen. They do not repeat it over and over or deliberately try to memorize it. Yet, years later, they can still recall the event vividly. According to the multi-store model, information should only transfer from short-term memory to long-term memory through prolonged rehearsal. In this example, no such rehearsal occurs, and yet the memory is clearly stored in long-term memory. And this shows that important emotional or meaningful experiences can enter long-term memory directly, suggesting that rehearsal is not the only mechanism for long-term storage. As a result, the MSM oversimplifies how long-term memory formation actually works. And this suggests that human memory is more complex and flexible than the MSM allows. A strength of the MSM is its practical and clinical value. The model has helped psychologists understand different types of memory impairment. For example, patients with damaged short-term memory can still have intact long-term memory, and vice versa. And this has been useful in developing memory rehabilitation strategies. In conclusion, the multi-store model of memory has been highly influential and is supported by substantial research evidence. However, it is limited by its reliance on artificial materials, its oversimplified view of STM, and its emphasis on rehearsal as the primary route to long-term storage. While it provides a useful foundation, later models have built on and refined its ideas to better explain how memory works in real life.